CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Robin Dwyer. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. 4 people, including a child, are killed in Russian strikes on a southern city in Ukraine. Rescuers are working to free those still trapped under the rubble. Hundreds of mourners attend funerals in Pakistan for some of the 54 people killed in a suicide bomb attack. Niger's ousted president seen for the first time since a military coup last week, as the leader of neighbouring Chad heads up mediation efforts. China acts to stimulate consumer spending as manufacturing and service activity lose steam in July. And Britain's Prime Minister confirms plans for over 100 new oil and gas drilling licences. Environmental groups call it short-sighted and selfish. At least 4 people, including a 10-year-old girl, have been killed in a Russian airstrike on the southern Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih. Rescuers are trying to free people still trapped in the rubble. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky has said that war is returning to Russian territory after 3 Ukrainian drones were shot down over Moscow. Our correspondent Louise Greenwood reports.
Smoke billowing from a 9-storey apartment block in the city of Kryvyi. The clock to rescue those still trapped inside.
At around 9 o'clock this morning, 2 missile strikes hit the city. In this 9-storey building, the 3rd to 8th floors are totally destroyed. Another missile hit a building at the Economic College. As of now, unfortunately, already 31 people are injured. 1 person is in a serious condition.
It's the latest in a series of missile strikes by Russian forces in recent days across central and southern Ukraine that has killed civilians in Zaporizhzhia, Kherson and Sumy. On Telegram, President Zelensky accused Moscow of stubbornly attacking cities, city centres and shelling civilian objects and housing. Moscow claims that Kyiv is wasting resources in a campaign that's left thousands dead. On the battlefield, both sides claim to be making advances. Ukraine around the besieged city of Bakhmut and Moscow in the south around Zaporizhzhia. In a surprise update, the chief of the Moscow-backed Wagner mercenary group said that while he was not currently recruiting fighters, he was likely to do so again in the future. While it's unclear if new Wagner troops would bolster the effort in Ukraine, Yevgeny Prigozhin said there was a need for what he called a new group that will be better able to protect the interests of our country. But in Ukraine itself, efforts are continuing to remove any trace of Russian influence from its territory. In Kyiv over the weekend, the Soviet hammer and sickle emblem was cut from the city's motherland monument, Europe's tallest statue. Metalsmiths are now at work to replace it with the 3-pronged trident of Ukraine in time for August the 24th, when the nation will celebrate its 2nd Independence Day under Russian attack. Louise Greenwood, CGTN.
Well, let's head to Russia and talk to our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova, who's in Moscow. So, Dasha, President Zelensky saying that the war has arrived on Russian territory, and Moscow has blamed Ukraine for those drone strikes on Sunday.
From the very beginning, saying that that was yet another attempted act of terrorism committed on the Russian territory. So we understand the security measures have already been beefed up, and the Kremlin has said very clearly that it is not just in the Russian capital, but also in other cities across the Russian Federation. But at the same time, the Russian officials are trying to make sure that the acts like that just showcase and demonstrate to the world what Moscow describes as the terrorist nature of Kiev regime, saying that, of course, those attacks are often overseen from the West. That's according to Nikolai Patrushev, who had Russia's Security Council as the secretary there. So we understand Moscow is blaming, indeed, Ukraine. But at the same time, we understand that in Moscow there are no plans to increase the level of terrorist threat. But attacks have been taking place elsewhere. We have seen an attack in the Bryansk region that is bordering Ukraine, where a drone has struck a police station. We also have seen attacks in the area of the so-called special military operation in Donetsk. At least one person died as a result of those strikes. So definitely Russia is paying close attention to what is happening, saying that those attacks are only proving that the goals of the so-called special military operation in Ukraine have to be achieved. And interestingly, we've heard from the head of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, today, saying that at the moment he's not recruiting, but also saying that the group is still defining the next task, saying that they are becoming clearer and clearer. But undoubtedly, in his words, these tasks will be carried out in the name of the greatness of Russia. So certainly we're yet to hear whether Wagner Group will be participating somehow in the conflict in Ukraine, while we also understand that some of his fighters are already working in other structures of the Russian forces, of the Russian armed forces. So certainly these issues are being taken into account.
And Dasha, Russia has been commenting on the planned peace summit in Saudi Arabia next month.
Well, that's right. We have heard the Kremlin saying that indeed Moscow welcomes any initiative that aim to find a peaceful and negotiated solution to the crisis in Ukraine. But at the same time, Moscow says it does not see at the moment any prospect for that, citing the position of Ukraine. Moscow also notes that it has to be involved into finding the peaceful solution for Ukraine, because Russia's legitimate interests have to be involved. That's according to a source that has been quoted today by Russia's RIA Novosti news agency. And also we have heard from the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov that Moscow certainly will be following the results of these negotiations, but at the same time Moscow still waits to see the definition of the goals and aims of these negotiations. Interestingly, we have heard also from Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson for Russia's foreign ministry, saying that if these negotiations will show that the so-called approach of President Vladimir Zelensky is leading everyone to an impasse, then, and the West understands that, then certainly that will be a fruitful result of any negotiations.
Dasha, thank you very much. Our correspondent Dasha Chernysheva in Moscow. Hundreds of mourners have attended funerals in Pakistan after a suicide bombing killed at least 54 people and wounded nearly 200. The attack on Sunday had targeted a political gathering. Although nobody's claimed responsibility, police suspect the Islamic State group could be behind the bombing. Our correspondent Daniel Khan is in Islamabad.
The incident occurred when more than 400 JUIF members and supporters had gathered under a tent in the town of Khar near the Afghanistan border for a workers' convention. Authorities say the bomber detonated himself in close proximity to the stage. Among the casualties was Inspector General of Police says 10 kilograms of explosives was used with ball bearings and other materials. An investigation has been launched, but the situation remains tense. So far, no group has claimed responsibility for the incident. Now, we know that Bajaur is a remote district bordering Afghanistan and was once a focal point in the global war on terror. Over the past few months, Pakistan's law and order situation has significantly deteriorated, with the terrorist groups carrying out attacks across the country with alarming impunity. The militant group, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, whose talks broke down with Pakistan in November, has escalated its attacks, specifically targeting police in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and areas near the Afghanistan border. Meanwhile, insurgents in Balochistan province have also intensified their violent activities, forming an alliance with the TTP. Pakistan has expressed serious concerns about the banned Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan finding safe havens and operating with freedom in Afghanistan. Daniel Khan, CGTN, Islamabad.
The president of Chad has been in Niger for talks with the leaders of a military coup after they detained the country's elected leader last week. Mahamat Idris Deby also met President Mohamed Bazoum himself, first time that he's been seen since being removed from office. Deby is leading mediation efforts to end the crisis after West African leaders gave those behind the coup a 7-day deadline to give up power or risk military action. China and Georgia have upgraded their bilateral ties to a strategic partnership. The two sides issued a joint statement highlighting deepening cooperation in areas such as politics, the economy and education. The announcement followed a meeting between Chinese Premier. The European Union and the Philippines have agreed to strengthen cooperation in maritime security. In the first visit to Manila by a European Commissioner in 60 years, Ursula von der Leyen pledged to work with President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. on sharing information and building up the Coast Guard. The two leaders also discussed resuming free trade talks and cooperation in the fight against climate change. France has voiced opposition to decoupling from China and hopes for more balanced bilateral trade relations. The country's finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, says decoupling from China is an illusion, and he welcomes Chinese investments in France, especially in the electric vehicle and battery sectors. The remarks come as Le Maire is in China for high-level economic talks. China has unveiled a series of measures to boost consumer spending after new data showed economic activity continued to shrink in July. Chinese markets rallied on the announcement. Our correspondent Li Jianhua is following the story. So, Jianhua, what's behind these new measures?
Yes, Robin, China's Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index came in at 49.3 for July. It has seen an uptick since April, but has remained generally under 50. See the red dotted line over there? It means China's factory activity has been contracting over the past 4 months. The official non-manufacturing PMI reading, namely China's service industry, came in at 51.5 in July, which means an expansion in service activity. But this is the lowest growth so far this year. And the latest attempt to boost the country's economy, Chinese authorities rolled out 20 measures to boost consumer spending. The new energy cars, including electric vehicles, support for home upgrades and purchasing household appliances and electronics. The government is also encouraging people to spend more on dining, culture, tourism, sports and healthcare services. Boosting all of these efforts in rural areas is also a priority.
Jianhua, thank you very much. Our correspondent Li Jianhua. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. 2 people dead and more than 31,000 evacuated as heavy rainfall continues to batter Beijing. And Britain green lights over 100 new licences for North Sea oil and gas extraction, but environmental groups see red.
Roger, Ricky, loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome! We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. A reminder of our headlines. 4 people, including a child, are killed in Russian strikes on a southern city in Ukraine. Rescuers are working to free those still trapped under the rubble. Hundreds of mourners attend funerals in Pakistan for some of the 54 people killed in a suicide bomb attack. And China acts to stimulate consumer spending as manufacturing and service activity lose steam in July. Two people have died in Beijing as downpours continue to batter the city. China's capital recorded its heaviest rainfall this year as Typhoon Doksuri passed over. Hundreds of roads were flooded, forcing 31,000 people to flee their homes. Well, our correspondent Yu Li is in Beijing. So what's the situation like in Beijing now?
Well, it's been raining for days in northern China. Apart from Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei and nearby provinces has also suffered from continuous downpours. In the mountainous suburban areas in the capital and nearby region, roads and bridges had collapsed. Vehicles and homes had been washed away. As you have mentioned, 2 people have been found dead caused by the rain. Thousands of people had been evacuated in suburban areas. The highest red alert was just issued for landslides in Fangshan district in the next 48 hours. Emergency rescue and disaster relief is in progress now. The situation in the city center is also quite worrying as the authorities downgraded the alert in several central districts during the day, but reissued the highest red alert hours ago for potential waterlogging. As for the latest, according to the latest weather forecast, that the downpour will keep hitting the city until Tuesday night.
So what kind of disruption has this bad weather caused so far?
Well, residents were suggested to stay at home as much as possible. Scenic spots and museums were closed. Performance and sports activities have been suspended. Some companies and institutions have allowed employees to work from homes, and transportation had been largely disrupted. Nearly 200 flights have been cancelled. The highway was closed and the bus routes have been suspended. And earlier, 2 high-speed trains have been stranded for 30 hours. Currently, thousands of passengers and crew members have been evacuated to safe locations. As people are returning to work on Tuesday, there will be a big traffic jam to come in the morning. Back to you.
Yuli, in Beijing, thank you very much. In the Philippines, many parts of the country remain underwater after Typhoon Doksuri hit last week. Meanwhile, another typhoon continues to intensify, worsening monsoon rains across the country. Our correspondent Gretchen Malalad reports.
The Philippines is still reeling from the effects of Typhoon Doksuri, which left more than a dozen people dead and over 1 million Filipinos affected. Now, Typhoon Kanun has intensified and it has accelerated over the Philippine Sea. Even if it's far from any landmass or will not make any landfall, it will continue to enhance the southwest monsoon and trigger occasional monsoon rains over the western portions of Luzon and Visayas Islands. We are experiencing a bit of relief from constant rains Monday morning, but rain clouds are still hovering on the horizon. I'm here in Malolos, Bulacan, in the village of Katmon. From where I am standing right now, it's only knee deep, but as you go further, the houses here are flooded up to chest deep. Residents here are still trying to recover from the aftermath of Typhoon Doksuri, but the threat of monsoon rains by Typhoon Kanun has even made the floods here higher. As you can see here, the river here has overflown and inundated the houses in this village.
My kids are with my mother-in-law because we don't have any place to sleep because our house is flooded. Our situation now is so difficult. We also haven't worked in days because we can't leave our families like this.
Our situation is hard. It's so difficult to keep all of our things dry and put them on a higher place in our house. Our appliances are heavy. We also need food and clean water.
The Bulacan Provincial Disaster Agency says that 95 villages in the 12 municipalities of the province are affected by the flooding. There's damage to agriculture and around 14,000 individuals were displaced. But it's not only here in Bulacan that has been badly affected by the typhoon. Several provinces in the northern Philippines like Cagayan, Ilocos Norte, Bataan, and Pampanga have reported serious flooding, agricultural damage, and hundreds of displaced families. The Weather Bureau says Typhoon Kanun has further intensified before dawn on Monday and now has a maximum sustained winds of 150 kilometers per hour from 140, and its gustiness is now up to 185 kilometers from 170. The typhoon is expected to leave the country between Tuesday morning and afternoon. It may pass close to Japan's Okinawa Island between Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning. Gretchen Malalad, CGTN, Bulacan Province.
Environmental groups have condemned a decision by the British government to offer more than 100 new licences for oil and gas drilling in the North Sea. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says the decision is entirely consistent with reaching net zero by 2050 and will boost the UK's energy independence. New carbon capture projects were also announced. Well, let's talk now to Anthony Froggatt, who's a Senior Research Fellow in the Environment and Society Programme at Chatham House, a leading British think tank. Great to have you with us, Anthony. Thank you for joining us. So the British government is saying that the idea behind this is to achieve energy independence and energy security. Why is that significant? Why is that needed?
Because what we've seen over the last year in particular is greater concerns on the importation of energy because of higher oil and gas prices as a result of the war in Ukraine. But I think unfortunately what we've seen is the government getting out of balance the two policy objectives. One is securing energy supply, and the second is meeting climate change objectives. And I think that by awarding new licenses, what the government is doing is telling to other parts of the world, well, it's okay to develop your oil and gas licenses. And that goes against the trends that we're seeing. The International Energy Agency has said that the exploitation of any new oil and gas developments would unfortunately not enable us to meet the net zero target, so the internationally agreed 2050 climate objectives.
Well, as you point out, there has been criticism that these goals rather go against the country's climate aims to get to net zero by 2050. And the point being, shouldn't we be cutting back on fossil fuels rather than facilitating their greater use?
I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, in some ways, what we've seen from your two previous reports is the significant and growing impacts of climate change. And if we continue to pollute, then these impacts will get far, far worse. So we do have to take a stand. The world has agreed objectives of trying to limit global warming to around 1.5 degrees. If we continue to open up oil and gas licenses, then those targets won't be met.
We should point out, of course, that these are just licenses to look for gas and oil. It could potentially be years before any reserves that were found can actually be tapped. With that in mind, is this a backwards-looking move?
I think as you point out, it isn't something that will impact the energy supply in the UK immediately. And this is said to be a priority. As I mentioned before, the war in Ukraine has increased energy prices, did raise huge concerns over access to energy. And so therefore, what I think would be much better would be measures that can achieve or have an impact within the short term and also address both climate change and energy security simultaneously. And the two obvious examples of that are energy efficiency, whereby you either install equipment to reduce the amount of energy that you need, or you encourage people to change behavior so that they don't waste so much energy, both of which are quick to do and very cost effective. And then the second is to put in place new supply options that, again, are cheap and quick to do. And the two most obvious areas of that are onshore wind and renewables. And so if I were in government, those are the two areas, efficiency and onshore renewables, that I would prioritise in order to address the twin problems of energy security and climate change.
And what about the carbon capture element of this announcement? Some people have called that greenwashing, but is it that, or is it part of the future on the path towards net zero?
I mean, I think there are certain sectors in which carbon capture and storage may well play and is likely to play a really important part, in particular some of the heavy industrial processes like steel manufacturing. But I think if we try to say, well, we're going to develop a whole new set of fossil fuels because we're going to do CCS, I think in some ways it's misjudging timetables and possibilities. CCS is tested at a small scale, but has never been tested on the scale that would be necessary were it to be absolutely widespread in terms of its deployment.
We've also seen something of a watering down by the UK on reforms to the carbon market, effectively making it easier for industry to pollute here compared with countries in the EU. Are we seeing a bigger move away from climate-friendly policies in the UK?
I'm afraid that seems to be the indication. And it's not just the carbon market, the carbon prices that you talked about. We've seen various statements from the Prime Minister in terms of talking about the need for proportionate and sort of more rational environmental issues. We've seen the Secretary of State in charge of housing talking about potentially slowing down or putting back some of the targets for energy efficiency within households. And I think these are sending very worrying signals. The UK has seen itself and has been a leader in terms of climate change. It hosted very successfully the large international conference on climate change in 2021, COP26. But since then, it seems to be rolling back on some of these things. And I think as we go through to the next big climate summit in December of this year, I think the UK policies will be under a spotlight.
Anthony, great to talk to you today. Thank you for joining us. That's Anthony Froggatt from Chatham House. The Women's Football World Cup now, and Australia have cruised into the knockout stage of the competition after dealing a crushing blow to Olympic champions Canada with a 4-0 victory in Melbourne. Cheered on by the home crowd, the co-hosts put on a spectacular show right up to the last minute, sealing the result with a penalty in stoppage time. This is the first time since 2011 that Canada has left the tournament in the group stages. Nigeria's Super Falcons are heading to the last 16 after a goalless draw against the Republic of Ireland, who've now been knocked out of the tournament. This is the third time the African side has advanced to the knockout stages in the Cup. Nigeria's next opponents will be decided later this week when the final Group D games are played. Zambia have clinched their first ever victory at the tournament after beating Costa Rica 3-1. Defender Lushomo Muimba netted the fastest goal of the tournament so far with a spectacular volley just 2 minutes after kickoff. The victory puts them third in their group, meaning they'll miss out on qualifying for the knockout stages. And Japan won their group after beating Spain 4-0 in a clinical performance by the former champions. They scored 3 in the first half, and despite Spain gaining momentum as the game went on, Japan's defence kept a clean sheet. They've yet to concede a goal at the tournament. Japan face Norway in the last 16 on Saturday. China is preparing for their toughest match yet at the tournament as the Steel Roses get ready to take on England's Lionesses on Tuesday. Our correspondent Greg Navarro reports.
All 5 FIFA Women's World Cup matches being played here at the stadium in Adelaide are sold out. On Tuesday night, the expected crowd of about 13,500 people are in for quite a treat when Asian Cup champions China take on European champs England. England currently sits atop Group D in first place after wins over Denmark and Haiti. A win over China would see it advance to the knockout stage in that top spot. A win for China over England would see it advance to the knockout stage for a 7th Women's World Cup. A draw, however, makes things a bit trickier, and its path to the knockout stage really depends on what happens in the game between Denmark and Haiti. That's also being played here in Australia on Tuesday. Now, China won its last match against Haiti by a score of 1-0, and it did so despite being down a player, playing with just 10 players because of a red card to Zhang Rui. Now, England also won its last match. It did so against Denmark by a score of 1-0, but lost its star midfielder, Keira Walsh, due to injury. She is not expected to play here on Tuesday when England faces off against China. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Adelaide.
And finally, not so much lost in translation as greater understanding. That's the aim of one of Tokyo's most complex transport hubs, as it tests out automated translation booths to help foreigners. They allow customers and a station attendant to talk, while the display spells out the words in Japanese and one of 11 other languages. The translation window was installed this month at Seibu Shinjuku Station. It's on a line that serves around 135,000 passengers a day. Let's look at our top stories again. 4 people, including a child, are killed in Russian strikes on a southern city in Ukraine. Rescuers are working to free those still trapped under the rubble. Niger's ousted president is seen for the first time since a military coup last week as the leader of neighbouring Chad heads up mediation efforts. And China acts to stimulate consumer spending as manufacturing and service activity loses steam in July. And that is The World Today. Thanks for watching. There's more news on CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. We're back with more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.